reported that they did not have a job. 44% reported that they did have a job. Holding down a job lowers the likelihood of deviant behavior, and it is a good indicator of a good work ethic and good people skills. It also helps to occupy some free time. Next slide. Gang involvement. 68% of youth reported being involved in a gang. 32% reported not being involved in a gang. Gang involvement exponentially increases the likelihood of deviant behavior. Next slide. Hobbies. 76% of youth reported that they had an appropriate hobby, as opposed to the 24% that reported they did not. Or, they either did not have a hobby or it was an inappropriate. Next slide. Overall status with life. 84% of youth reported being overall satisfied with their life. 16% of youth reported not being satisfied. Overall satisfaction with life is a good indicator of a lower likelihood of deviant behavior. Next slide. What would you change? 12% of youth would change their family. 16% would change their school. 12% would change their friends. 48% would change where they live. And 12% would change their job. Next slide. Educational levels of the guardians, be it starting with the parent, the father, and so on, and working your way down. 72% of fathers completed high school or less. 12% of fathers completed some college. 16% of fathers completed college. 0% completed advanced degrees or graduate school. Educational levels of the mother. 84% of mothers completed high school or less. 12% completed some college. 4% completed some college, or completed college, and 0 completed graduate or advanced degrees. Now, I want to take note of something. The vast majority of mothers completed high school or less. That's also true of fathers, but the percentage for mothers is much higher. Next slide. Ambitions and plans for life. 62% of these youth reported having no ambitions or plans for their lives. 38% of youth reported having ambitions and plans for their lives. Next slide. Understood by family. 76% of youth reported that they did not feel like their family understood them. 24% reported that they did feel like their family understood them. Understood by friends. 72% said their friends understood them. 28% said no, their friends don't understand them. Next slide. Understood by adults. 92% of youth reported that they did not feel understood by adults on average. 8% of youth reported that they did feel understood overall by adults. Next slide. Are you a leader or a follower? 52% of youth saw themselves as a leader. 48% defined themselves as a follower. Now, a leader here does not imply a positive role model. So a gang leader would be a leader, or a drug runner or drug dealer is a leader in their own minds. This is about self-perception. Next slide. Peer pressure. 32% of youth reported that they never do anything simply because other people want them to do it. 40% reported occasionally doing something because others wanted to do it. 8% reported doing something daily. 20% reported doing 2 or more things daily simply because somebody else wanted them to do it. In-school detention. 100% of the youth have served in-school detention at least once this year. Next slide. Out-of-school suspension. 88% of the youth have served out-of-school suspension at least once this year. 12% have not. Next slide. Arrested. 76% of the youth have been arrested at least once this year. 24% have not. Next slide. Passing all your courses. 52% of youth believed they were passing all their courses. 48% believed they were not passing all the courses. Now this is in context versus 72% of the youth believed that they would pass the year. 52% are not passing their courses, but 72% believes they will pass the year. See, this is a incorrect perception of reality. Again, 28% of the youth did not believe they would pass the year. So only 28% in this sense had a correct reality of the implications of not passing your courses. Next slide. Read outside of school. 100% of the students reported that they do not read outside of school. Never. Next slide. Religious services attendance. 68% of youth said they never attend religious services. 32% of the youth said they rarely attend religious services. 0% of the youth said they regularly attend religious services, and that's 3 or more times a month. Self-perception, next slide, and economic status. 64% of youth classified themselves as being poor. 32% of youth classified themselves as being middle class, and 4% classified themselves as rich. Now, try if you can to remember these numbers and bear them in mind as we continue our discussion on perception of economic status versus actual economic status. Actual economic status. 100% of youth owned a cell phone. 32% of youth's family owned their home. 44% of these youth and their family owned at least one car. 100% of these youth owned one or more of the household convenience items such as a stereo, a gaming system, big screen TV, or a computer. 32% of the youth or their family owned either a snowmobile, a four-wheeler, a jet ski, a boat, and or a camper. Now remember that 64% of the youth who reported that they were poor. Next slide. Labeling. 56% of the youth were willing to label themselves. 24% chose a positive label, 32% chose a negative label, and 44% refused to label themselves. Next slide. One-word description. When asked to describe themselves in one word, 72% of the youth chose a positive word. 28% chose a negative word. Next slide. Are basic needs being met? 60% of the youth report that they are unsure of their daily source of food and shelter. 40% believe that their basic needs are being met. They get 3 meals a day and a safe, quiet, warm place to sleep each night. Now, Maslow tells us that the basic needs are the most important, and when somebody is not having his or her basic needs being met, it is impossible for that person to put their energy or focus on any other need that's lower in the hierarchy. The basic needs are the highest needs in the hierarchy, and they must be met before we can move on. Now consider that in light of the 60% of youth report that they are unsure of their daily source of food and shelter. Next slide. Drugs. 4% of youth reported that they had never tried drugs before. 60% of youth reported that they had tried drugs and they use them on a rare occasion. 16% of the youth reported that they use drugs on more than 3 occasions a week but less than 7. 20% of the youth reported that they use drugs daily. So you're talking about 36% of these youth use drugs at least 3 times a week. One thing we know for sure is that drugs are directly linked to deviant behavior, also to the lack of ambition and the lack of or loss of self-control. Next slide. Smoking. 80% of these youth report that they smoke. 20% report that they do not smoke. Next slide. Getting enough sleep. 64% of youth reported getting 6 or less hours of sleep each night. Now again, this goes back to the basic need of Maslow. We're told that a developing adolescent needs at least 8 hours of sleep or more a night. Now, 64% of these youth are reporting getting 6 or less each night. Next slide. Conclusion. There are a lot of factors here that lead to deviant behavior, many of which are directly connected to deviant behavior. Also, there are many that are indirectly linked to deviant behavior, and some which are circumstantial but give us excellent insights into the lives of these youth. Next slide. Conclusion. As Christians in the helping professions, we earnestly strive to help people, including the at-risk youth. Sometimes, in order to truly help them, though, we need to understand it is not so important to draw connections and conclusions as it is to simply seek to understand and support. I trust that all this information is a way of helping us all do just that. Also, I encourage you to go back through the slides. I went through them rather quickly. Go back through the slides, review the information, and draw your own conclusions and connections and insights into them. Thank you very much.